And up
Right.
until last year, or if we go back to 2019, when Trump first floated the
Right.
idea of, back then it was buying Greenland, not taking over, as it looks like, it sounds
Right.
more like now. People just, I don't think any country would like someone coming in to steal territory.
Denmark just told Donald Trump to keep his hands off Greenland, and they didn't sugarcoat it. The message was sharp, unapologetic, and rooted in national pride. But the part no one in Washington seems to have noticed is this. While Denmark publicly shuts down Trump's Arctic ambitions, Canada is quietly becoming the Arctic power the U.S. can no longer overlook. Trump may be talking about Greenland again, but Canada is the country actually shaping the future of the North.
The story began when Trump revived one of his most bizarre foreign policy ideas, that the United States should take over or even acquire Greenland. It's a notion he first floated in 2019, and now, in his second term, he's bringing it back with even more confidence. The Danish response was immediate. A senior commentator, reflecting the public mood, said bluntly that Greenland is part of Denmark in the same way Hawaii or Alaska are part of the United States. Her exact words cut through the noise. No one wants someone coming in to steal territory. She also reminded viewers that the United States already has significant military presence in Greenland through the 1951 Defense Agreement, but only because Denmark allows it. In other words, Washington can deploy assets, but Copenhagen still holds the keys. Greenland, for its part, is an autonomous nation within the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own culture, its own government, and a long history of resisting any attempt, especially from superpowers, to dictate its future. So when Trump floated the idea of U.S. control again, both Denmark and Greenland pushed back immediately and forcefully.
One thing is clear. Trump's attempt to reassert U.S. dominance in the Arctic is running into the limits of U.S. influence. He may talk about Greenland as if it were real estate, but Denmark isn't selling, and Greenland isn't interested. The whole episode exposes a weakness in Trump's foreign policy approach. Allies don't appreciate being treated like properties, and sovereign nations push back when you try. What makes this moment even more damaging for Washington is that it arrives during a period of already strained alliances. Trump's tariff fights with Canada, tensions with Europe, and unpredictable diplomatic messaging have all contributed to a broader sense that the United States is no longer the steady hand it once was. While Trump creates friction, Canada is quietly building partnerships. Canada and Greenland resolved their last territorial disagreement, the Hans Island dispute, through peaceful negotiation in 2022, creating an atmosphere of trust between Ottawa and Nuuk. Since then, Canada has leaned into deeper cooperation, from climate research to Indigenous governance and Arctic transportation links. Ottawa is preparing to open a consulate in Nuuk, something no Canadian government had ever prioritized until now. This isn't symbolic. It reflects a long-term strategy. Canada wants a direct diplomatic presence in Greenland at a time when Greenland's leaders are actively looking for stable, respectful partners. Prime Minister Mark Carney's Arctic strategy is also accelerating. Canada is strengthening its satellite systems, upgrading northern defense infrastructure, and enhancing coastal surveillance, all while investing in local communities and respecting Indigenous leadership. Unlike the U.S. approach, Canada isn't trying to take over anything. It's building relationships, and those relationships are bearing fruit.
The world is paying attention to the Arctic in a way it hasn't before. Melting ice is opening new shipping routes. Russia is expanding its military footprint. China is positioning itself as a near-Arctic state as it funnels money into research stations and mineral projects. In this crowded landscape, Canada stands out for its combination of diplomacy, stability, and geography. Ottawa now controls the political tone of the North in ways nobody expected 5 years ago. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's effective.
What makes this shift even more significant is that Arctic alliances are no longer determined by military power alone. Nations are placing greater weight on environmental stewardship, indigenous partnership, and long-term resource governance. Canada's credibility in these areas gives it influence that sheer force cannot replicate. As the region warms and competition intensifies, countries are increasingly looking for partners who bring legitimacy and predictability, qualities Canada now projects more clearly than either Washington or Moscow. Denmark's decision to confront Trump is more than a bilateral disagreement. It shifts the balance of power in the Arctic. By shutting down Trump's Greenland talk so publicly, Denmark reinforces a fundamental truth. The United States doesn't automatically lead in the North anymore. And that opens an enormous opportunity for Canada. Unlike Trump's White House, Canada has treated Greenland with respect. It has emphasized cooperation, not control. And Greenland's leaders have responded positively because Canada's approach aligns with their own values, especially around climate resilience, education, and responsible development. The contrast is stark. Trump's approach raises suspicions. Canada's approach builds trust. That's how influence works in the Arctic today. This moment reveals a dramatic divide between two countries that share the world's longest border. Trump's America is increasingly confrontational, unpredictable, and focused on short-term victories. Carney's Canada is steady, pragmatic, and positioning itself as a long-term partner for northern nations. Canada is meeting NATO's defense target early, investing in new submarines and patrol vessels, and modernizing northern infrastructure from Nunavut to the Northwest Territories. These aren't symbolic gestures, they're signals that Canada intends to be a decisive Arctic power, not because it wants to dominate the region, but because it wants to shape it responsibly. As Denmark pushes back against U.S. overreach, Canada is quietly demonstrating the qualities Arctic nations value most: stability, respect, and consistency. And here's what's becoming increasingly clear. The Arctic is shifting toward a multipolar model where influence is earned through credibility, not coercion. Canada's ability to balance defense modernization with diplomacy gives it a unique advantage. While Washington wrestles with political turbulence, Ottawa is presenting a calm, coherent Arctic vision, one that resonates with governments from Copenhagen to Reykjavik, and, crucially, with leaders in Nuuk who are seeking predictable partners during a period of global tension. Denmark's blunt message to Trump, "Hands off Greenland," was more than a territorial stand. It was a statement about sovereignty, partnership, and the future of Arctic governance. For the first time in a long time, the United States isn't the dominant voice in the region. The vacuum is being filled not by aggression or ambition, but by diplomacy, and Canada is the country most ready to step into that role. The question now is whether Washington will recognize this shifting Arctic landscape, or whether Trump will continue pushing ideas that alienate allies and strengthen Canada's hand. Either way, the Arctic is changing, and this time, Canada is shaping the map.
Canada's new government will rebuild, reinvest, and rearm the Canadian Armed Forces.
The Prime Minister's clarion call to defend against a superpower's imperialism.
What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state. We give them protection, military protection.
Donald Trump turned his threats into a trade war, pushing Mark Carney to turn the military into an economic shield.
I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule.
Canada just delivered a message that Washington did not expect to hear so soon, and certainly not so clearly. Prime Minister Mark Carney has launched the most significant military reinvestment in modern Canadian history, an overhaul driven not by distant threats from Russia or China, but by something far closer: rising sovereignty tensions with the United States under Donald Trump's second-term trade war. This is the moment few imagined possible. Canada is rearming to protect its economic future from its closest ally, and Trump can no longer pretend the old imbalance still holds. Standing in Ottawa, Carney declared that Canada will meet NATO's 2% defense spending benchmark this year, a target long criticized as out of reach. What makes this extraordinary is that Canada is hitting the goal 5 years ahead of schedule. Carney's budget injects more than $82 billion into defense over the next 5 years, rebuilding a force stretched thin by decades of underinvestment. The plan includes hiring and training more soldiers, improving pay for those serving abroad or in the Arctic, modernizing Canada's surveillance and patrol capabilities, and making Arctic sovereignty a national priority. But the real shift lies in how Canada intends to spend this money. For decades, 3/4 of Canadian defense procurement flowed straight into the United States. Now, Carney is ending that era. He announced that Canada will no longer be sending 75 cents of every procurement dollar south, signaling a redirection of contracts toward Canadian companies and toward reliable partners in Europe and Asia. That transition is already visible. Germany and Norway are competing with South Korea to build Canada's next submarine fleet, a contract worth more than $100 billion when counting manufacturing and half a century of maintenance. Sweden has launched its own charm offensive, offering to build Gripen fighter jets directly in Canada, and Ottawa is openly reconsidering whether it will buy more American F-35s after Trump's tariffs raised costs and reduced the industrial benefits promised to Canadians. In other words, Canada is not just rebuilding its military, it is redesigning its entire strategic posture. Carney's move is not a symbolic upgrade. It is a strategic correction to the economic reality that Trump created. When the United States began slapping aggressive tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and even clean tech components, Ottawa realized something fundamental. If Washington can weaponize trade, then Canada must strengthen the tools that protect its economy. Carney is reframing national defense as an economic shield, a way to ensure Canada cannot be coerced through tariffs, trade disruptions, or political unpredictability. This recalibration arrives at a moment when Trump's tariffs are tearing North America's supply chain from the inside out. His promise to renationalize production in the U.S. is colliding with industrial reality. In Michigan, the CEO of Alpha USA, a mid-size auto parts supplier, now warns his business faces an existential threat because the components they need, many sourced from Taiwan and other Asian markets, have become too expensive under Trump's tariff regime. They cannot switch to U.S. components because those alternatives do not exist. This single story captures the wider truth. The auto supply chain is too integrated to be rebuilt by political force. For decades, Canadian, American, Mexican, and Asian producers have operated as one ecosystem. When tariffs hit one link, the shock ripples across the entire system. Trump may score political points by forcing Stellantis to preserve a shift in Michigan, but long-term investment decisions across the continent are being frozen. Small suppliers are struggling, corporate planning is on pause, and North America's once predictable manufacturing base is drifting into uncertainty. Carney understands that markets hate chaos. His brand is stability, rules that do not change overnight, frameworks that investors can trust, and economic leadership that does not rely on bluster or punishment. His military reinvestment is an extension of that idea. A sovereign Canada, with its own industrial base and its own defense infrastructure, is a Canada that cannot be bullied by tariff diplomacy. This shift matters even more in the Arctic, where climate change is opening new maritime routes and accelerating competition from Russia and China. For decades, Canada's Arctic defenses lagged behind its ambitions. Now, Carney is pouring resources into northern patrols, surveillance systems, and the submarine fleet needed to guarantee that Canada, not the U.S., not Russia, not China, controls the waters surrounding its northern frontier. And it is here that one of the most overlooked factors emerges, the economic value of the Arctic itself. As sea lanes open and resource potential grows, the region becomes a future trade corridor connecting Europe and Asia. By boosting Arctic defense, Canada isn't only projecting sovereignty, it is protecting future export routes and mineral access that could redefine the nation's economic map. This adds a layer of urgency Washington cannot ignore, because a more capable Canada in the Arctic limits America's freedom to maneuver in a region it once assumed would default to U.S. oversight. And this is where the political symbolism becomes impossible for Trump to ignore. Earlier this year, Trump joked that Canada could be America's 51st state. It was meant to be lighthearted, but Canadians did not laugh. The remark landed in the middle of a tariff war. It reminded Ottawa that sovereignty is not something Canada can take for granted, and it strengthened Carney's case that national defense, economic independence, and Arctic control must be treated as one integrated project. This transformation also reflects a new geopolitical reality. Canada is diversifying away from the United States. Carney wants to double non-U.S. exports within a decade, deepen industrial ties with Europe and Asia, and reduce Canada's exposure to Washington's political volatility. The submarine and fighter jet competitions now show this clearly. Canada is no longer buying American equipment because it always has. It is choosing partners based on long-term strategic value, stable supply chains, and mutual benefit. For the first time in decades, Washington cannot assume automatic compliance from Ottawa. And that shift, more than the spending, more than the submarines, is what makes Carney's move so significant. Carney's defense reinvestment is more than a budget line. It marks a turning point in the Canada-U.S. relationship. Canada is no longer relying on American goodwill to safeguard its sovereignty or its economy. Instead, it is building a strategic foundation that protects Canadian interests even when Washington chooses confrontation over cooperation. As Trump intensifies tariffs, disrupts supply chains, and injects political volatility into the North American marketplace, Canada is quietly constructing a shield, economic, industrial, and military, that ensures it cannot be pushed around. And so the real question now is this: if Canada is no longer dependent on the United States, how will Washington adapt to a North America where Ottawa is not the junior partner, but a sovereign power ready to defend its interests with confidence and with force? Lumber just became the latest proof that Canada is no longer waiting for anyone, especially not Washington. With a sweeping new strategy, Ottawa has turned a long-standing vulnerability into a national advantage, positioning Canada's lumber sector for a level of independence and global reach it has never enjoyed before.
As of this afternoon, there is more money coming to help maritime softwood lumber companies and workers struggling with the impact of those U.S. tariffs. The Prime Minister announced a relief package about an hour or so ago. This is something that a lot of people in New Brunswick have been watching for.
We will also provide an additional $500 million to the Business Development Bank of Canada's Softwood Lumber Guarantee Program to ensure that companies have the financing and the credit support that they need to maintain and restructure their operations during this period of transformation.
Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped in front of cameras this week and delivered something Canada's forestry regions have been waiting years to hear: a decisive, well-funded, long-term plan to strengthen the lumber industry at home and expand its reach abroad. For decades, lumber has been one of Canada's most important exports, supporting thousands of families in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. Yet, despite its importance, the sector has spent too many years reacting to decisions made outside Canada's borders, especially decisions coming from the United States. Carney changed that direction in one afternoon. He announced major support that does more than patch over short-term challenges. It signals a national pivot. His plan subsidizes the movement of lumber across the country so producers can reach new markets without relying on traditional U.S. routes. It strengthens financing for mills large and small, ensuring companies have the credit they need to modernize, automate, and prepare for global competition. It streamlines federal programs so businesses no longer waste time navigating scattered funding channels. And it launches a sector-wide transformation task force to chart a future in which Canada sets the terms, not reacts to them. Every line of the announcement carried the same message. The lumber industry is no longer at the mercy of external power. Canada is taking control of its own economic destiny. For years, pressure from abroad pushed Canada into a defensive posture. Each time another tariff or trade decision landed, the country had to respond after the fact, protecting jobs and stabilizing mills that suddenly faced uncertainty. What Carney delivered this week flips the script. Instead of reacting to shocks, Canada is now shaping the future of its lumber economy. This is more than a policy shift, it is a change in mindset. Canada is treating lumber not as a sector to shield from outside turbulence, but as an asset to build global strength. The railway subsidies alone show a willingness to rethink how products move across provinces, how companies access ports, and how Canada uses its geography to its advantage. A country with some of the world's largest and most sustainable forests is finally building an infrastructure system worthy of that position. Carney's delivery mattered as much as the details. His tone was steady, confident, and unmistakably forward-looking. He was not pleading for cooperation or waiting for signs of goodwill from any foreign capital. Instead, he spoke as the leader of a country charting its own course. Lumber was not framed as a victim of external pressures, but as the foundation of a new phase of Canadian economic independence. For communities across New Brunswick, Quebec, and British Columbia, where mills anchor local economies, this message carries emotional weight. It tells workers that Ottawa sees them not as collateral in a foreign dispute, but as central players in a national project. It tells businesses that the federal government is ready to partner with them as they innovate and grow. And it tells global buyers that Canada intends to remain a reliable, stable supplier of high-quality lumber long into the future. What makes this announcement even more powerful is how seamlessly it fits into Canada's broader economic framework. Carney has repeatedly committed to unlocking up to $1 trillion over the next 5 years to reshape the country's industrial base. The lumber measures announced this week are part of that ambition, not a standalone bailout, but one piece of a national transformation. Investing in forestry means investing in manufacturing, railways, ports, clean energy, indigenous partnerships, and rural development. It strengthens Canada's ability to export beyond its traditional markets and reduces over-reliance on any single partner. It creates the conditions for value-added products, from engineered wood to advanced biomaterials. And it positions Canada to benefit from a world that increasingly values sustainably sourced building materials. Lumber, in this context, becomes more than timber. It becomes a strategic pillar, a catalyst for innovation, an anchor for communities, and a symbol of Canadian resilience. One of the most striking parts of this week's announcement is how confidently Canada is presenting itself to international partners. The country is no longer signaling desperation or frustration with external pressures. Instead, it is showcasing readiness, capability, and stability. With global demand for sustainable lumber growing, Canada is uniquely positioned to take the lead. Its forests are among the most responsibly managed on Earth. Its producers have decades of expertise. And now, its government is aligning funding, logistics, and long-term planning behind them. This shift matters. It means Canada is entering global markets not as a quiet secondary player, but as a country prepared to compete at the highest level, with confidence, not caution. The new measures tell the world that Canada intends to be a dependable, innovative, and highly competitive force in the global lumber economy. Another subtle but important change lies in the domestic response. Provinces that often disagree on economic priorities found common ground on this announcement. Forestry-dependent regions see it as overdue recognition of their economic value. Investors view it as a sign of long-term stability. And national commentators are praising Ottawa for taking a firm stand and offering clarity after years of uncertainty. This unity strengthens Canada's position externally. When a country speaks with one voice, global partners take notice. And in the lumber sector, where reliability and consistency are crucial, Canada now looks more aligned and more predictable than it has in a very long time. Canada's new lumber strategy marks a turning point, not only for the sector but for the country's entire economic identity. It signals a Canada that refuses to live in the shadow of external decisions, a Canada that builds its own pathways to prosperity, and a Canada that understands its strengths, from its forests to its workforce, and is finally leveraging them to full effect. The question now is not whether Canada can protect its lumber industry. The real question is how far this new confidence will carry, and which sector will be next to experience the same transformation. Canada just made a move that redraws the map of North American power. While Donald Trump spends another week battling corporate backlash over tariffs and economic uncertainty, Mark Carney has quietly delivered one of the most consequential breakthroughs in decades, a pathway for Canada to ship its energy directly to Asia without relying on the United States. A new Pacific pipeline, a united business sector, and a national strategy that blends AI with energy. This is Canada stepping out of America's shadow, and Washington knows it.
Pen finally to paper. A long-rumored memorandum of understanding was officially signed Thursday. Most notably, it'll open the door to a new crude pipeline from northern Alberta to the Pacific.
Today is a great day for the people of Alberta and for all of Canada.
The idea is to eventually move at least 1 million additional barrels of oil a day.
The announcement came in Calgary, where Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a memorandum of understanding that lays the foundations for a new pipeline from northern Alberta to the British Columbia coast. For the first time in a generation, Canada is preparing to build an export corridor aimed not at the U.S. market, but at Japan, South Korea, India, and the rapidly growing economies across Asia. Reporting from Reuters confirmed that the project could eventually move up to 1 million barrels of oil per day, instantly transforming Canada's position in global energy markets. The political atmosphere around the signing was just as remarkable. Carney walked into a luncheon of more than 1,000 business leaders and received a standing ovation. Even AP News noted how unusual that moment was for a Liberal Prime Minister in the heart of Canada's oil country. The agreement doesn't just open a path to the Pacific, it reshapes federal and provincial responsibilities. Ottawa agreed to freeze its emissions cap for the oil and gas sector, adjust the tanker ban on BC's northern coast, and suspend clean electricity rules that Alberta said were blocking investment. Alberta, in return, signed on to expand industrial carbon pricing and fund a major carbon capture system known as Pathways Alliance. And in a surprise move that signals where Canada is heading, Alberta committed to building thousands of megawatts of AI computing capacity, aligning perfectly with Carney's ambition to make Canada an AI superpower powered by clean energy. This is not one deal, it is a blueprint for a new economic model. Canada's pivot toward Asia is more than a strategic adjustment. It represents the end of a long-standing vulnerability. For decades, America acted as the bottleneck through which Canadian crude was forced to flow. Pipelines ran south, refineries were built south. Pricing power and political leverage sat firmly in U.S. hands. Trump leaned heavily on this imbalance. His tariff threats worked because Ottawa had nowhere else to send its oil. The lack of alternatives boxed Canada into a one-market reality. A Pacific corridor changes that reality entirely. By opening the door to a diverse set of Asian buyers, Canada can negotiate from strength rather than fear. The dynamic between Ottawa and Washington becomes more balanced. Instead of being a junior partner in continental energy politics, Canada positions itself as a global supplier capable of serving multiple regions. Trump's ability to use energy as a political weapon is weakened the moment Canada gains another outlet.
This is where the psychological shift emerges, and it is one of the most important elements of this pivot. For decades, Canadian policymakers operated under the assumption that geography locked the country into a one-way relationship with the United States. That assumption shaped trade, diplomacy, and even national identity. By targeting Japan, South Korea, India, and emerging Southeast Asian markets, Canada steps into a global arena it long hesitated to claim. This isn't just diversification, it is a statement of maturity. It signals that Canada is ready to compete on equal footing for global demand. This new confidence will shape investment decisions, inspire long-term partnerships, and create opportunities that were unimaginable when the U.S. controlled every negotiation point. With Asia in play, Canada's leverage increases, the U.S. loses strategic grip, and the continent's power balance shifts in ways Washington can no longer fully control. But this realignment isn't happening only in energy. Carney's insistence on weaving AI infrastructure into the agreement reveals a broader strategy. AI requires enormous amounts of power. Alberta's resource base, combined with Canada's clean grid and supportive federal incentives, gives Canada a unique position. While Trump's America faces grid challenges, rising hardware costs from renewed tariffs, and tech sector frustration over immigration limits, Canada is constructing a model where energy supports AI supports industrial growth, and industrial growth supports export diversification. This integrated model is not just an economic plan, it is a competitive advantage. By pairing abundant energy with predictable policy, Canada offers the stability that global tech investors crave. In contrast, the U.S. is stuck in short-term political cycles that constantly disrupt long-range planning. This gap will only widen as AI demands accelerate worldwide. It is a cycle the U.S. cannot replicate easily because its internal politics have become too fractured to sustain long-term planning. Carney's reception in Calgary underscores this contrast. In Canada, business leaders are rallying behind a government that offers clarity and direction. In the U.S., major sectors are increasingly alarmed. Manufacturers warn that Trump's tariff strategy is raising costs and undermining competitiveness. Tech firms object to restrictions that make talent harder to recruit. Farmers are suffering as China, India, and others shift purchases to Brazil and Argentina in response to U.S. policy unpredictability. Even traditionally conservative business coalitions are openly expressing frustration with Washington. The domestic atmospheres in the two countries are diverging: stability in Canada, turbulence in the United States. For global investors, that contrast matters. It matters even more for geopolitics. America's historical leverage over Canada depended heavily on being the dominant buyer of Canadian crude. If Asian refiners begin securing long-term contracts, and early signals indicate they will, then U.S. refiners lose their privileged position. Canada becomes a supplier with options, not a captive exporter. And once that happens, Washington's traditional pressure points begin to disappear. This shift does not isolate Canada from the United States. It liberates Canada from being defined by it. Instead of reacting to American decisions, Canada is shaping its own economic future and building partnerships that align with a global, not continental vision. Canada has entered a new phase, one defined by confidence, diversification, and strategic independence. By opening direct access to Asia, resetting federal regulations, and tying AI development to industrial growth, Carney is building an economy that can thrive no matter who governs in Washington. Trump, meanwhile, is learning the limits of America's influence in a world that no longer revolves around a single superpower. As Canada moves toward Asia, strengthens its business alliances, and embraces a unified national energy AI strategy, the old assumptions about North American power are breaking apart. The real question now is whether the United States can adapt to this new environment, or whether Canada's pivot marks the beginning of a geopolitical shift that Washington never saw coming.